Right, so we're moving on to Chapter 3, which is bioenergetics. And we've talked previously in Chapter 1 about how a muscle contracts and how ATP is necessary for a muscle to contract. And so we need a continuous supply of ATP for muscle contractions. And we have a limited amount of ATP in our muscles, and so we have to constantly be regenerating ATP from the food that we ingest. And the primary sources or substrates that are used for ATP production are carbohydrates and fat. So what is ATP? It's adenosine triphosphate, which is an adenosine group, which has energy bonds between the three phosphate groups. And your textbook talks about catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism is when we take larger molecules and break them down into smaller molecules. So when we take and eat a piece of bread, it's then broken down into smaller molecules of glucose. And anabolism is just the opposite. We take small molecules and synthesize larger molecules. So an example is taking adenosine diphosphate, which is an adenosine with two phosphates, and if we add a third phosphate to it, we make ATP. So we're making a larger molecule. So we have this process of anabolism when we synthesize ATP. So we have both catabolism when we break down food into our simple forms of glucose or fatty acids, and then we have anabolism when we form our ATP as well. And so carbohydrates are a main source of for energy production, and they are any carbohydrates that we eat are broken down into their simplest form of glucose, and glucose then circulates in the blood and can be delivered to the muscle for ATP production. But glucose is also stored in the form of glycogen in both the liver and the muscle. So when we start to deplete our glucose stores in our circulating blood, glycogen can be broken down and form glucose, and so we have this new supply of glucose available to us. Liver and muscle glycogen are storage forms of glucose, and they are very dependent on our diet and our training. When we train, we deplete our muscle glycogen, but when we eat a diet rich in carbohydrates, we restore our muscle glycogen. Fat is another primary energy source. It is primarily responsible for fueling exercise at lower intensities and for longer durations. And as different from glycogen, which can be depleted as we exercise and we keep pulling on those glycogen stores, fat is difficult to deplete because we have ample supplies of fat on our body. Fat is stored, we have excess fat stored in our fat cells as triglycerides. And the triglycerides then we break down into free fatty acids, and it's as free fatty acids that are used in the cycle to produce ATP. And fat is a very rich source of energy for ATP production, and it produces more ATP in comparison to using carbohydrates or protein. And protein is not a primary source for energy. Protein we need to synthesize actin and myosin for the muscle, for the contractile elements, but the energy to fuel muscular contraction comes primarily from carbohydrates and fats. Protein can be converted into glucose, which we call gluconeogenesis, or it can be converted into fatty acids, which is lipogenesis. And so we can use protein as either glucose or fatty acids in a process where it's broken down to produce ATP. but protein can be used for energy. It's usually in starvation states or an extended bout of higher intensity effort. That's when we see protein being used. It can range up to 3 to 18% of the energy needed to produce ATP. Some sources say 10% is the max, but it's not at all a primary source. Uh, for ATP production, it can be produced either aerobically or anaerobically. Aerobic energy production or ATP production is in the presence of oxygen. So when we talked about in chapter 2, oxygen being delivered to the muscle and extracted from the blood into the muscle to produce ATP, that is aerobic energy production. Anaerobic energy production is in the absence of oxygen. We don't need oxygen available to produce ATP. So when we look at the 3 different food groups that we discussed, carbohydrates, fats, and protein, carbohydrates can be used in either aerobic or anaerobic energy production. So we can take glucose and we can produce ATP aerobically if oxygen is present, or we can also produce ATP without oxygen present or anaerobically. Fats and protein, though, those are aerobic energy production. So to use fats to produce ATP, it has to be in the presence of oxygen. So ATP, we split off a phosphate group. There's an enzyme called ATPase, which speeds up this reaction where we split off the phosphate. It liberates energy to fuel cellular work or our muscle contraction. And what we're left with then is ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. So we start out with ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, or adenosine with 3 phosphate groups. We liberate one of the phosphate groups and release energy, and what remains is adenosine diphosphate, adenosine and 2 phosphates. And so we need to reform more ATP, and we add another phosphate group to ADP to reform ATP. And when we donate a phosphate group to form ATP, we call this phosphorylation. And just another depiction of what ATP looks like: an adenosine group with energy bonds, high energy bonds between the phosphate groups. And when ATPase, the enzyme ATPase, acts on ATP, it liberates the phosphate and releases energy, and we're left with adenosine with 2 phosphate groups, and then a free phosphate group which is not attached. And when we talk about producing ATP, there's 3 different processes. A lot depends on how long the activity is, how intense it is, what substrates, what stores of glycogen, ATP, fat that we have available. And we have the phosphagen system, which uses ATP stored in the muscles and creatine phosphate, which are limited supplies in the muscle. And then we have the glycolytic or glycolysis, and that's the breakdown of glucose. And then the oxidative system, which is using fats, proteins, or carbohydrates to produce ATP in the presence of oxygen. So the first 2 are considered anaerobic. We don't need oxygen present to produce ATP in either the phosphagen or the glycolytic system. But the oxidative system, we definitely need oxygen present to produce energy. And so the first system is the phosphagen system, and that usually fuels exercise that lasts less than 15 seconds. So if you look at somebody doing a 100-meter sprint, that's the phosphagen system that supplies the energy for that physical activity. And the glycolytic system is usually 1 to 2 minutes efforts that are lasting 1 to 2 minutes, and then after that we go into an oxidative, which is over 2 minutes. But it's not a distinct start-stop. All three are going at the same time. It's just one is more dominant than the other. So the ATP phosphate creatine, or creatine phosphate, which falls under what we call the phosphagens, we start out with ATP, and it's acted upon by ATPase, the enzyme, and we're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a free phosphate group in energy. So we need to form more ATP for continuous muscular contractions. So a creatine phosphate will liberate a phosphate group, or the P, and it will donate it to ADP, and an enzyme called creatine kinase acts on it, and we're left then with a group called creatine, and then we have our new ATP molecule formed. So this uses ATP and creatine phosphate, which are at limited supplies within the muscle. And the phosphagen system is the start of all exercise, whether it's high intensity, low intensity, long duration. It's the beginning of all exercise, because the glycolytic and the oxidative system are progressively take longer to produce ATP. So our first initial parts of all exercise is the phosphagen system. But in addition, it is the primary source for short, high-intensity effort. So someone is a soccer player, they're easily jogging around the field, but then they go into a short burst of effort. That's the phosphagen system. And there again, it uses ATP and creatine phosphate stores that are already within the muscle. And these supplies are very limited, and phosphagen system can only fuel exercise for about 10 to 15 seconds. And being that it's a primary source for short intensity effort, it's a primary source for fast twitch muscles, which, being a larger motor unit, have a stronger contraction. And so these, the fast twitch muscles will have a greater supply of ATP and creatine phosphate. And as you can see here, the red is creatine phosphate and the blue is ATP. And if you look out at the very start, we were fully loaded with ATP. And as we start to exercise, our ATP starts to decline rapidly. And then as the creatine phosphate starts to resynthesize ATP, we still have a decline of ATP, but it's not as steep, and that's because the creatine phosphate is forming ATP. But at the end, you'll see how the amount of creatine phosphate drops. We start to deplete our creatine phosphate in our muscle, so we have a limited ability to synthesize ATP through the phosphagen system. Short duration can fuel short duration exercise and high intensity exercise.